Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am a professor of medicine and medical education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Director of Simulation and Patient Safety. I would like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, we plan to highlight Chapter 10 on mastery learning of clinical communication skills within our book called Comprehensive Healthcare Simulation, Mastery Learning and Health Professions Education. I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. Julia Vermylen, who is an assistant professor of medicine and medical education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. She serves as the co-director of the Northwestern Simulation Healthcare Communication Program. Julia, it's an honor to interview you today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. An honor to talk with you today.
So we usually start off by asking a little bit about your background and how you got involved in simulation and how you got to where you are now.
Jeff, I love that question, especially coming from you, because I think I really first got interested in simulation as a trainee. So I did medical school and residency here at Northwestern, as you know. I also got my master's in public health, where I had a growing interest in thinking about communication and healthcare spending and how we actually redesign our healthcare system to be more in line with patient-centered, goal-oriented care. And I think that is really where my love of communication came out of. However, my interest in simulation really kind of came out of my training and my experience to a plethora of mastery learning curricula that I was actually a learner in. So I was in some of the beginning studies. So I think I was really struck by how much confidence and competence that I gained from those training programs that I went through. And as my interest in communication skills continued to grow, I have always loved teaching. So as I started to think about how do we teach this, I was really struck by the lack of competency-based education programs there were for communication skills training, and really wanted to invest my time and energy there.
Well, that is pretty awesome. It's kind of exciting because I got to interview David Salzman, who also was a part of one of the original curriculum for Central Line. And now here you are. And I had totally forgotten about it. But yes, I actually did facilitate some of your learning with lumbar puncture, paracentesis, Central Line. And it's all blurred now as I get older. But, it's interesting because one of the things simulation-based mastery learning had always been criticized for is that it was so procedure-based, that we would always taste something that had very defined tasks or skills like a procedure where it could be step after step after step. And the criticisms then extended to, well, how do you do it for skills like teamwork or for communications? And then boom, here comes Julia Vermylen and creates this communication curriculum and kind of answers the critics. What was the need that you saw for developing a communication curriculum to teach?
I think it's interesting because I also think it's one of the criticisms often of communication skills training as well. People often think about it as this quote unquote soft skill that doesn't have hard outcomes. For a long time, people thought that this was either a skill that you were good at or you were bad at, and people didn't even think you could change behaviors. Well, over the last few decades, it's been shown that you can change behaviors with communication skills training, but no one thought to apply the same educational expectations to communication skills training as they have to procedural skills. So to me, this was a need on both ends, both from a mastery learning curricula standpoint and also from a communication skills standpoint. Additionally, when you look at the outcomes, when you start to go to patient-centered outcomes and changes in behavior at bedside, some of the studies began to fall short.
So you said that the studies fell short. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so some of the studies that tried to do follow-up surveys of patients found that they were unable to change the quality of communication skills that patients completed after they interacted with a trainee who had been through some of these educational programs. Now, there are many different reasons why that is, but one possible explanation is that if you look at the post-workshop skills that those learners had developed, they got each individual skill correct only about somewhere between 40 to about 70% of the time. So their outcomes were far below the outcomes of what you would expect for some of the, say, mastery learning procedural skills outcomes. So we couldn't help but ask ourselves, is it that the training didn't work, or is it that we didn't actually expect the same educational standard that we do for procedures? So I think that was a natural next step of, hey, let's see if we could raise the bar, actually increase the post-workshop outcomes, the post-curricular outcomes of our learners, and then start to look at whether this impacts patient outcomes and behaviors at the bedside.
So this is when good really isn't good enough. When you're doing an intervention and you get post-training scores of 40 to 70% correct, certainly that doesn't cut it. I don't want a clinician to be working with me, at least as the patient, that is a 40 or 70% good at what the task at hand is. And certainly thus comes mastery learning. But communication skills, I don't have to tell you, they're unique. So what's unique about communication skills training?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's 4 main things that make communication skills unique. So the first is data overload. There's so much information in the context of a conversation. Not only are there thousands of words, there's also the tone, the pace, the nonverbal communication, the silences, the pauses. All of those things could be things that you give critique and feedback on to the learner, that can be really overwhelming from the learner and also overwhelming from what is good enough and how do I assess this, right? There's also learner vulnerability. So this is a really vulnerable task. When learners are going and learning a new procedure and Dr. Barsuk says, hey, you actually should hold your hand like this or hold the probe a slightly different way, that ultrasound probe, the learner doesn't feel bad about themselves. And yet when you're giving feedback about communication, somehow or another, this often impacts their identity. They have this false notion that they're supposed to know how to do this, when this is actually a learned skill like anything else. The next one is learner exhaustion. So because there's so much information, they feel like their character is being evaluated. They're on display in front of their peers. Sometimes this can be a really exhausting task that you need to take into account when you think about training them. Because if a learner is exhausted or vulnerable, they're not going to be able to really incorporate that feedback and bring it forward. And lastly, there's variability in what is right. So if I'm talking to you and you get upset and you're emotional, sometimes it might be appropriate for me to say, can you tell me more about what's going on? Other times it might be appropriate for me to say, I can't imagine how overwhelming this is. It might also be okay for me to say, I can tell this really brought up something for you. This is really overwhelming. Can you tell me what's going on? Right? There's different ways to communicate that. So there isn't a clear right or wrong. And all of those things need to be addressed when you think about how you assess this, how you give feedback, how you do your deliberate practice, your curricular design. All of those things need to be taken into account.
So that tells you why we had critics about making communication skills a simulation-based mastery learning curriculum. You obviously did it. I know you have a pre-test and then you have some learning and some practice sessions. You use standardized patients and then you have a post-test. Talk to me about the difficulties and the successes and the barriers to creating an assessment tool for communication skills based on what the 4 unique things you just talked about.
Yeah. So, as you go about creating an assessment tool, I think it is important to still try to think about what are some of the key elements to this conversation. And as much as possible, trying to break it down into steps like a procedural skill. And this is what a lot of communication skills training does in the workshops, but it's important to do that in your assessment tool. So first, we really went back to the literature to see, are there other checklists? Are there other assessment tools that have been used in studies to assess skills? Are there guidelines? So when it came to, breaking bad news, for instance, the spikes protocol is a very well-studied protocol. Additionally, we were able to find multiple studies that had used assessment tools, actually often based off the spikes protocol, and also others that use some more generalized techniques. But because of this variability about what is right and what is wrong, we also felt it was important to have some scaled items, because it's not just, do you say the right things? Are the words correct? But also, how is it conveyed? How is it that you say it? How well do you respond to their emotion or their nonverbal? How good is their nonverbal communication? And overall, what is that like for the patient? So we went back to the literature. We also got content experts to get in the room to really go over our checklist in an iterative fashion. We had a couple different expert panels to really review our checklist. And we had to get together and watch videos of people breaking bad news and really see, how does this play out when we're actually trying to assess? And we found that we had to use multiple different models, checklists, as well as these scaled items. On the checklist, we needed to make the items as black and white as possible. So our first draft, for instance, has a pause after giving the bad news. And we found what defines a pause that's long enough? Is it a second? Is it 10 seconds? We ultimately had to decide on some number in order to make sure that we were consistent on that. And then we could use the scales to really assess, how did that play out? Because it is somewhat situationally dependent.
So you created these assessments based on the spikes format that had been previously published, assuming there was a lot of literature on the spikes protocol and it had shown to produce valid results. But you also added an expert panel, it sounds like, with the modified Delphi technique to settle on a final checklist. Then becomes the nightmare, as I would call it, is communication being a skill that's very interpretable. It must have been very difficult to get Interrater reliability. How did you guys achieve that?
So we found it was really important to watch videos together to make sure that we had the same interpretation of the assessment tool. And to be honest, part of that went into creating the assessment tool as well. So making slight wording variations in our checklist itself to be clear about what the expectation was. So some of this is editing the checklist in an iterative fashion until you're both on the same page. Similarly, we had to watch videos and together and really iteratively go over how you do, especially the scaled items. We also added behavioral anchors to our scales so that you could refer back to them and help you in especially those gray moments, be able to go back and say, okay, is this a 3? Is it a 4? Is it a 2? To really help you kind of nail between those different items.
So we got the assessment tool. We got it good. We had high Interrater reliability. You had a checklist that had content, construct, validity. You're happy with your assessment tool. So your pre-test and post-test are set. Now becomes the unique way that I know you do things when you do deliberate practice sessions. In another podcast, I was fortunate enough to talk to Dr. Walter Epic, who I consider one of the gurus of feedback and debriefing. And he actually called out the unique way that the team, Julia and your colleague, Gordon Wood, do the rapid cycle debriefing sessions during practice. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And the first thing I do want to acknowledge is that there are a couple different models for deliberate practice that people have used. And depending on the conversation at hand, it might be more appropriate to use a different model. Sometimes people use a one-to-one model. We decided to use a small group role play model where over the course of the workshop, we actually go through a series of different cases. In our model, typically 4 cases. Ours is based off the Vital Talk model. There are other models out there as well and have very specific kind of key pedagogical things that one should think about as they are going through a small group role play model. So overall, what we really deliberately focus on is that in a given moment, when you're working with a learner,